So Janet Fouts is a top social media coach. As a matter of fact, if you Google social media coach, she comes up #1, so she's doing something right.
Personal branding is working.
She's got it down. As a matter of fact, I'm going to ask her for some lessons afterwards. So. And Janet will moderate the program on open source, and she'll introduce this amazing panel that we have.
I will.
So, thanks.
Just kidding. Why don't you start, Kat?
Oh,
Start? All right.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kat Allman. I'm with the Open Source Programs Office at Google. What is the Open Source Programs Office? Google is built on open source, and so we have a whole team of people to make sure that Google contributes back to the community, follows appropriate licensing discipline, encourages Googlers to open source, and my team in particular does cool things like Google Summer of Code, and if you don't know what that's about, ask me in a minute.
I'm Elizabeth Krumbach. I'm a systems administrator for a small technology service provider called LinuxForce. On the open source side, I'm also involved with the Ubuntu project. I'm in the leadership council, the community council for the project. And I also work with Partimus.org. I'm on the board that oversees the work that we do, which is primarily putting Linux in schools in the Bay Area. So we set up computer labs and individual installs for teachers. And, these are schools who wouldn't have computers otherwise, so we bring in the hardware, we bring in the software, and then we maintain their networks. That's pretty much what I do.
My name's Bo Levens. I'm a developer with Automatic, and so I'm listed as WordPress. That's because we run WordPress.com, and our company is a big contributor back to the WordPress project. So on my day-to-day basis, I'm a developer. I've actually been a mentor in the Google Summer of Code twice, so you can also ask me about that, I guess. And yeah, as I said, our company is a big contributor back to open source projects, and everything that we do is run sort of with an open source mentality, because for the same reasons we run everything on open source.
So I'm Allison. I right now work at Nokia Mobility Solutions in Sunnyvale. The perspective I bring to this panel that may be a little bit different than other people is my academic background is actually in physics. I have very little formal training in software, but I think the great thing about open source is it is a meritocracy. It is something in the way of a public performance. And I think anyone can become an open source contributor, an open source participant who wants to. The opportunity is there for you. So I encourage anybody who's interested enough to attend this event to seriously consider being part of the spectacle, not just part of the user base. On to our moderator.
Okay, so my interest here is that I've been a coder for probably, I don't know, 15 years or so. Started out with a little PHP, and I did a lot of WordPress. I still do a lot of WordPress. And now that my business has changed a little bit and I'm a CEO, I'm really advocating for open source. And I think that's one of the things that I want to bring to the panel too, is that you don't have to be a coder to participate in open source and support it. So what I wanted to ask the panel first is, what do you think open source means? And what examples of open source can you give besides your own platforms?
Sure. Well, to me, the real realization of what open source is looking at the Git repositories for the Linux kernel. I can tell what Linus Torvalds did today, literally, because I can look at the diffs of what he committed from yesterday. So when I say it's a public performance, I mean the record is up there for everybody to see. And that's kind of terrifying and exciting at the same time, I think, as a professional. You know, the Linux kernel is very famous, but I think it's important to realize that open source is all around us and runs more and more things. For example, I work in the embedded area, and for all the jokes about internet-enabled refrigerators and so forth, most of those devices do run on open source software, which should be comforting to you. But I'll let Bo comment.
Good to know we can hack our fridges if we need to.
Totally.
So I guess from the perspective of got like the opposite end of the spectrum from diffs. I would say that open source, to me, is basically anything that's created in an open and transparent fashion by a community that's not controlled by commercial interests. And that goes the full spectrum from the code at the sort of nuts and bolts level, all the way through to like the marketing. If you look at someone like Mozilla, they ran a full page ad in the New York Times in an open source fashion. So obviously that's like the total opposite end of the spectrum from someone sitting, writing monospaced code on a screen somewhere. And everywhere in between you've got people doing tutorials and documentation and like building websites to get information across about the code that's being written. So I think there's a huge stack of things that people can be involved in that are often neglected in more technical projects. So depending on your skill set, you can get involved anywhere in that stack.
So for me, I think the most important thing about open source is how high quality all the software is. The company I work for, we deploy our Linux systems. All the software we deploy is open source software. So we're using Apache, which is still the biggest web server in the world. So for me, it's when I first approached it, it was all about how useful and great the software was. And then from there, when I first installed Linux, I barely knew what an operating system was. And to be able to move from not knowing what it was to eventually being part of a major distribution in a few years was pretty amazing. I don't have a formal education, so I was able to learn everything that I need to know for my job and for all the open source project I work with from community members. I learned everything I know from attending events like this, attending Linux users groups, getting more involved in the Ubuntu project to learn more about Linux from peers. I didn't have to pay for any of it. I didn't have to go to formal classes. I didn't have to leave my living room or change out of my pajamas. So it's been quite a journey, and it's really high quality software, an amazing experience. I've learned quite a lot.
My roots in open source go back, they long predate the term open source. Once upon a time, I worked for a company called Mount Xinu, which actually is Unix trademark backwards. Mount Xinu had the first commercially supported version of Berkeley Unix back in the day. And so my idea of open source goes more towards, to look at it from a clinical perspective, you could say it's the academic method. It's science as it's been done for millennia, of people building on each other's knowledge, working together to think and move ideas forward collectively. Philosophically, I like that a lot. And frankly, the rough and ready fun of getting together with a bunch of friends and putting on a show in the barn and creating the future, there's not much that's better than that.
Okay, so since we're here to talk about women in open source, what women do you really want to point out to people as role models, as maybe potential mentors in the open source community? Who's really out there that is making a difference that you can really point to as a showcase? Let's start on that.
I'm a huge fan of Stormy Peters. Stormy was in the open source office at Hewlett-Packard. Then she was the executive director of the GNOME Foundation for a number of years, and she's presently, I believe, in developer outreach for Mozilla. Low-key, ridiculously eloquent. If you have a chance to see her present, I would urge you to do so. She's also involved in bringing Linux-based computers to a small rural school someplace in Mexico, and a heck of a nice person, so I recommend her.
So I think I'd have to say Amber Grainer. She's a big contributor to the Ubuntu project, doing a lot of outreach and writing articles. She actually just installed Ubuntu about 2.5 years ago, I think. And her husband's a kernel developer, and he's been a kernel developer for years. He works for the company behind Ubuntu, Canonical. And just one day she was like, you know, you're going to all these things, and you're going to all these events, and you're doing all this stuff. What is it all about anyway? So he gave her a CD, and she installed it. And within 2.5 years, she's now writing for Linux Magazine. She's now editing or actually helping write the 6th edition of the Ubuntu book, and she's just made remarkable progress in all this time, and it was just because she was eager to learn and try it. Her kids say they lost their mother to Ubuntu, but you know, she's just made miraculous progress, and it's a really good example of how you don't have to be hardcore technical really to get involved, because she doesn't consider herself a techie, and even though she started programming now, and she's, you know, we're being like, it's starting. She got involved and she made a lot of progress and has been very successful. You know her as well, so she's certainly out there. It's a very good role model.
I'm going to say two, one from the WordPress community and one who's not. So from the WordPress community, I would say a woman called Andrea Rennick, who's contributed a huge amount to our community in fantastic tutorials and documentation, which is, I find, one of the most important things in the open source community. And if it's not done well, it can mean the death of a project. And if it's done well, it can mean the absolute success of it. I started developing in PHP 11 years ago, and the main thing that got me going was the amazing community documentation. So she single-handedly basically took the multi-user version of WordPress and made it something that actually made sense to people, which is now a significant part of core and what makes WordPress very powerful for people running bigger networks. And the non-WordPress person would be Leah Culver, who is she's a contributor to the Django project, and she started Pounce, which was purchased by Sixapart. She's a hardcore developer, and she's, again, very low-key and just out there absolutely killing it, developing amazing stuff without any fanfare or expecting anything amazing to be happening. So, yeah.
So I actually want to talk about a friend of mine, and I'm not going to say her name because she'd be pissed at me, but I am impressed by people who are inventive, not only in coding, but also in solving life problems and business solutions, people who can be creative in all different spheres of life. And I have a friend who became unemployed, decided to become an Android programmer, taught herself Android programming, started organizing kind of meetups to practice Android programming with other people, became an expert on Android programming and started offering some free classes on Android programming, which had 40 people and were sold out in advance and packed, and then progressed to offering paid classes on Android programming. And here's somebody who was in adverse circumstances, and rather than say, woe is me, life is unfair, this sucks, I don't know what to do, she basically created a career for herself in a whole new area, just out of whole cloth, and now is successful in something that there's a lot of demand for that nearly no one else does. So, that's another part of what open source means to me, is that you can just create these opportunities and create new business models yourself. You can. I'm here to bring you that message.
I love that message, and I think that's where I'd like to go next, is that there is a real communal group around open source. It's really, really easy. If you can figure out what you want to learn, you can go out there and learn it, and there are people that will take you by the hand and answer all your questions. So let's kind of speak to that a little bit, and about how somebody who is kind of, maybe they're in between jobs or they really want to do something else, how can they get into this? How can they get started and find their passion and really make it go and run with it?
I'll just talk about a little personal victory I had recently where I found that I learn better if I hear audio of something while I'm reading it by taking language lessons, which is something I didn't know about myself. And then I decided that I wanted all the technical documentation that I read out loud to me. And then I found out there wasn't a way to do it on my system, so I made one myself by doing some terrible coding. And I put it up as a web page, and sure enough, I heard from some people at the KDE, for those of you who know what that is, Accessibility Project, that they had never considered my solution before, and they were discussing it on their mailing list. So here's something I made to solve my own problem that is really one of the more embarrassing programming efforts of all time, because I wasn't interested in elegant solution, I wanted it today, and I did it in an hour. And you know, you don't have to be a genius to get started in this. If you have an itch, scratch your own itch. If you make something that's useful to you, the chances are it'll be useful to somebody else, and they'll probably take your solution and improve it, because that's what happens a lot in open source.
Yeah, I think that specific sentiment of if it's useful to you is probably useful to someone else is probably one of the underpinnings of most open source projects. Most things start because someone is scratching some sort of an itch, and then other people see that and say, oh, that's either exactly what I want, so I'm just going to use it, or it's almost what I want, but hey, the source is available, I can make a small modification, and you know, with a little bit of tweaking, I can make it do what I want to do. And that's often the way that people just sort of end up going down the rabbit hole of open source. Like Matt Mullenweg, the guy who the founding developer of WordPress, did exactly that. He was interested in typography, so he made a tweak to a previous open source project called V2, and then basically got sucked in, and like 7 years later, he's sort of running the whole project. But from the perspective of like how to change yourself and getting mentorship and learning things on your own, I think that's one of the beautiful things about the open source world, is that there's, like, it's all about having resources so that you can do it yourself. Everything about it is about everybody leading themselves through the process. So any good project is going to have good documentation. There's going to be tutorials. There's going to be hopefully reasonably well-documented code. You know, there's going to be groups of people discussing things, whether it's a mailing list or an IRC channel or a blog with comments or whatever it is. The whole point is that you have this dynamic community that's going on all around you, and all you have to do is be willing to be a part of it. So like, that's exactly how I got started with WordPress. I was using it for some work that I was doing, and I was having trouble with something, so I posted this huge, ridiculous, long thing saying I'm trying to do all of this stuff, and this doesn't work, and ended up having a back and forth with 3 other people who were having the same problem, and we fixed it, and we submitted a patch, and off you go. So I think it's really just about being willing to take that first step and get involved for whatever reason, whether it's because you spot a bug or because something doesn't work quite the way that you want it to. Just being willing to get started, and you probably end up getting sucked in and being involved as well. It's very satisfying.
So I guess continuing on that thread, I think there's a big misconception, perhaps not among this crowd, but that open source and technology is a very solitary thing. You know, you're sitting in your room alone and you're coding, but it's completely the opposite. I talk to more people now that I'm involved with open source than I have in any other hobbies in the past and any other time in my life. And being involved with Ubuntu, I also have sponsorship opportunities. So they'll fly community members around the world for our summits. So I've even got to travel places, new places that I never would probably otherwise. But continuing what you were saying, getting started can be really challenging because you see these massive projects. I mean, WordPress is very impressive. It's very popular. It can be very scary to walk up to WordPress or Ubuntu and say, "This is an amazing product. Where can I possibly help?" So my first open source contribution was a really small project. It was an IM gateway, an instant messenger gateway. And what I did, I just stopped in their IRC channel and I sat there for a couple of months. I didn't really say much. I just watched what people were talking about, what they were discussing, and somewhere along the line they said, hey, we need to rewrite our documentation because it was written by the project founder who was a developer and not really great at writing documentation. So it was really hard to understand. So I said, well, I can do documentation. How hard is that? Well, I found out how hard that was. It turned out to be, and I had to learn DocBook, and it was crazy, and it was hard, but it was really satisfying because then I got my name in the changelog, and that was super exciting, and that really got me started with open source. So it's for me, it was really about just taking what I say. You said taking the first step, and the first step for me is usually joining a mailing list or joining a chat channel, reading what other people are doing, and then just at some point, if you see something that sparks your interest, just jump on that and start working on what they're doing. Offer your suggestions. If you need to start slowly, because I start everything slowly with all of this, because I'm afraid of being wrong or something. But usually it's perfectly fine. So. Getting started and something like that, it can be pretty easy, and it's not that scary usually. And if it is scary, you'll notice that by watching the mailing list or watching the IRC channel. If everyone's being mean to each other, I just walk away.
Maybe another project.
Yeah, try another project.
I had to smile when you posed this question because I actually have a talk that I've given a number of different places around the world about how to get started in free and open source software. And my fellow panelists have pretty much covered the high points here, so this is great. I don't have to say anything, but just to recap, think about what you're interested in and go out and find a project that does that. Some people are interested in social justice, crisis management. There's a great project called OpenMRS about an open source medical records framework started out in Africa to help with AIDS prevention. Anyway, there's every project under the sun. I mean, I think Ravelry has open source underpinnings for people who knit. Find something you're interested in and then lurk. Hang out on their IRC or their mailing list, and not only read the history of the project, but definitely pay attention to how people treat each other. Some projects pride themselves on being pretty aggressive in how they deal with each other. If you are comfortable with that, by all means. If you prefer a slightly more welcoming to newbies community, then you can find such projects. Do your homework, read the history, and if you're a coder, offering a bug fix is a very good way to get started. If you're not a coder, documentation is huge, or helping out at an event. Logo design, UI, QA, and frankly, helping other people on the mailing list, answering simple questions. It takes the burden off the more experienced people, and encourages other newcomers to get involved with the project. And then before you know it, you discover you've given up sleeping.
Yeah, that's great success.
So I want to add to that a little bit because I'm kind of an old IRC rat and lots of things like that. And the thing is that all of these have communities, and it's really, really smart to watch them for a while. You learn a lot, and you'll find that as new questions come up, you can answer them because you saw the answer yesterday and nobody noticed, or it was up there a week ago. If you start keeping track of things, all of a sudden you're the go-to person with the answers, and pretty soon you really are. So just by watching and absorbing the culture and absorbing the knowledge that's in these forums is huge. And I'm not saying this because Google's here, but Google is your friend. I don't care what your problem is. If you've got some kind of problem with software, or you're working for a nonprofit and you have a problem that you need to solve, that you need some kind of chat system, start Googling. And when you find the community, you may find the people in there that can help you, and either help you develop it yourself or develop it for you. My next question for the panel, which really speaks to what Kat said, is okay, so some of those places are really scary. Some of them are really technical, some of them are really combative. Some of them are really snarky, so most of them. So, and for some women, that's a real barrier to get in to entry. And I will tell you that it's a barrier for men too. But in particular, what barriers have you seen in your careers, and how have you dealt with those? Kat.
Okay. Back in the day when, it's on, hello. I learned early on to use an email handle that didn't reveal my gender, because in the 80s and 90s, if I posed a technical question, I would get no response at all. As time wore on, I actually didn't even get come-ons or sexist remarks, because it was that weird that there would be a girl online. Now, unfortunately, depending on the community, with an obviously female online name, you sometimes get attention that you don't want. That's one thing to look for when you're going back through mailing list logs, etc., is look for a community where the community code of conduct, whether it's formally written out or not, is explicit. Unless you don't care and can blow people off that are annoying, which is actually has its fun moments. But anyway, I'm sort of rambling here, so I'll stop here.
So one of the things we've done in the Ubuntu project and other projects, we have an actual separate project for women, the Ubuntu Women Project. And the goal of the Ubuntu Women Project is to get women involved in the wider project. And a lot of open source projects have been starting to do this. Ubuntu actually has Ubuntu Women, Ubuntu Youth, because there's a lot of ageism going on too. I mean, if you're a younger person involved in coding and stuff, it's tempting to go up to them and be like, oh my gosh, you're 14 and you're doing coding, that's so awesome.
Cute.
So yeah, and it's actually, I mean, fortunately you grow out of ageism, but so Ubuntu's been starting these little offshoot groups that are catering to certain members of the community who just want to get the work done, they want to start getting involved, and they don't want to deal with, you know, someone saying, oh, how cute, you're a girl. But in general, the Ubuntu project, and a lot of them, especially the bigger projects, they're getting better about, especially the sexism. You don't see it quite so much. And a lot of them have started adopting a written code of conduct. And Ubuntu really championed that within the sphere. So it's getting a lot better. Certainly, early on, I had the same experiences with it. I mean, I always used a nickname that showed my gender, but I certainly knew that there was a consequence to doing that. So, yeah.
So I've actually also had that, people assuming that I was a girl based on my name, ironically enough. But within the WordPress community, we have a bunch of people who use sort of genderless nicknames. And I know for a fact that at least a couple of them are women, but a bunch of them are guys as well. So I actually really don't like to suggest that, because I think it's ridiculous that it's necessary, but it seems to get the job done. And I know that the general assumption from all the other majority of people involved in these projects, who tend to be guys, is that if a name has no obvious leaning, it's probably male. So they just assume that it's another man, and they just sort of treat them as they would anyone else. That being said, I think obviously that shouldn't be necessary. But either way, getting involved in these communities, looking back through the history, is definitely valuable to know how people interact, just to sort of get a feel for how it is that these people interact with each other. For example, within the WordPress community, I think people are generally pretty respectful, especially if you've got any sort of contribution to show. If you can demonstrate that you've done anything for the community, people, I mean, I can't speak for other projects really, but I've seen it where, you know, people who haven't got anything that they can specifically say, here's what I did for this community, here's why I should have a voice, those people don't tend to get heard very well. There's two sides of the whole meritocracy, right? There's the positive and there's the negative. So until you've actually got something to show, it can be very difficult to be heard, to get started, to sort of gain traction, if you like. But as soon as you've got anything, and it can really be the smallest thing, if you can demonstrate that you're doing something, that's your sort of immediate jump over that barrier to entry and get started. One of our most recent core committers, and we don't have many of them, his first patch was like a 2-character CSS change, I think, from memory. And like 3 months later, he's a core committer, which is unheard of.
Change the world.
Yeah.
Those 2 characters.
But actually, as an example of someone who sort of did their homework, I found out recently, I was talking to him, and he said that before he did that 2-character change, he read every single post on our mailing list, like in the entire archive, which goes back to 2005 or something, and every single ticket and discussion on Track, which is thousands and thousands of pages. So he, like by the time he'd done that, he literally knew WordPress better than anybody else working on it, and then made a 2-character change.
That's cool.
I'd like to amplify a little bit what Bo said about having a record and kind of establishing an identity. I always use my name, Allison Chaikin. I have since I started posting to Usenet in 1989, where you can go and in the archives and see that my first posting was blank. But I've been very surprised as someone who has changed fields that there are fewer women in open source than there are in physics, which I would never have guessed. And I actually have encountered more sexist behavior since I joined the open source community, which is a little bit disappointing to me. But I've always been in a small minority, and I've always had the same mechanism of dealing with it, which is simply in any circumstance, whether in a mailing list, whether in IRC, phone support actually is, for tech products is where I've actually had the biggest problem with sexism, I would say. And the mechanism I use is simply to show that I'm serious. If you ask someone a technical question that they don't know the answer to, in fact, they perhaps have no idea, they feel panic. And they forget that you're a woman asking, because they start thinking of you as a person who might be smarter or better informed than them. And the fact that you're female ceases to matter. And that's really the goal we're striving for here. In open source, I've found a very effective mechanism of dealing with people who treat me inappropriately in person, is I go up to them and I say, Emacs is far superior to VI. A controversial, nearly indefensible statement. But once again, the person who hears this forgets that I'm a woman, because all this time, or some other controversial thing like, you know, WebOS is better than Android or something. And the person you say this to totally forgets you're a woman because you've infuriated them. And now you're having a technical discussion, which once again is what you wanted. So fundamentally, my mechanism for dealing with sexism is to just change the subject. If people have passionate opinions about tech topics, you can always steer the discussion away from what you're wearing or something like that that you don't want to talk about to the thing you do want to talk about every single time. It just takes a little practice. And so when people treat me inappropriately, I just ignore them and change the topic of the discussion. And if you show that you're serious by having intelligent opinions about whatever topic it is, people take you seriously. I basically, when I've used this mechanism, have never had a problem with a person. Even someone who's known to be rude, if you switch the topic to something that interests them, that they care about, if it crosses their mind that you know something that they're interested in, you've won, and the battle is over.
Right on, I like that. So let's talk a little bit about mentorship then, to that extent. How do we, as women that are working in open source and men that are working in open source, mentor people to get involved in it? It's back to you.
I need to think about that.
Okay, Kat.
Fine, put me on the spot. So how do we mentor people? Gently?
Too easy.
Da-dum-bum. Something that I think a lot of us in the technology field run up against is a lot of us are really shy. I know I am. I play a self-confident person at work, but I go home and shut the door and shiver. Yeah. And it's hard to ask for a mentor. It's hard sometimes to believe in your own knowledge and opinions enough to feel qualified to be a mentor. So when I say gently, I mean give yourself the credit that you deserve and then play that forward, pay that forward, however the pop expression goes. Each of us here has taken the initiative to go out and learn something new. So give yourself credit for that and then recognize and support that in other people. The simplest actions can have a profound effect on other people in terms of encouraging them to try new things, to try things that are hard for them, and just to generally stretch a little bit.
I guess talking about really practical mentorship, I'm involved with a couple projects that have formal mentoring projects inside them. So the Ubuntu Women Project's one of them, so I make myself available in the Ubuntu community. So if anyone ever has a question about anything with Ubuntu, they can send me an email and I'll get to it as soon as I can, as long as I'm around, you know, not traveling or something. But first of all, responding to email very quickly. If I don't know the answer, I'll just respond and say something like, you know, I'm not sure, I'm gonna go ask someone about this, or whatever. But making myself available in the community for that. Also, in a broader way, I always respond to interview requests. I mean, I'm very busy and I don't have a lot of time, but one of the points in there's a how to encourage women in Linux how-to that was put out several years ago. And there's this one section in it that said, you might be shy and you might be not wanting to talk about yourself because, you know, you're self-conscious or you don't think you've done enough, but someone is coming to interview you or ask you questions. I always accept, because it's not me talking about me, it's gonna be me inspiring someone else, because I know when I read interviews from other women, it's really inspiring for me. So for me, getting over that hurdle of talking about myself and coming to things like this was big. But again, mentoring programs have been really successful in the Ubuntu community because people don't know where to start. In a project as big as Ubuntu, it's very overwhelming. If you join a regular Ubuntu channel, someone might say, well, here's the Getting Involved page, and it's seriously like 20 pages long. It's a wiki page, and it has a table of contents, so I'll give it that, but it's huge. So it's really easy to it's much better to sit down with someone and talk to them and say, like, okay, what are you interested in? And they're like, well, yeah, I mean, even when I got involved, I didn't know that I'd start writing documentation. I didn't know that I wanted to be a sysadmin. I didn't know that I didn't really care for coding directly. But I was able to talk to people and get exposed to things. So it's really about exposing people to the opportunities out there and not just giving them a list of stuff to work on, because they'll just give up and go away because it's hard. So.
Yeah, so playing off some of that, I think there's a few different ways that you can act in some sort of a mentorship role. Definitely being at something like this, being sort of publicly seen and heard is a really good one. And like other end of the scale might be doing things as simply as like writing a tutorial on how to do something, and then answering questions about that tutorial. Because that's kind of I see a lot of documentation that people write, especially if it's not sort of part of the quote-unquote official documentation for a project. It's kind of like asynchronous mentorship. It's like, here's a little piece of my brain and my experience. I'm going to put it on a page somewhere, and then you go look at it, and if you've got questions, I'm available to answer. And when you see people who are actively replying to comments on a blog post or something like that to me is an awesome form of mentorship. So I think that is one. I think a sort of very lightweight way is basically just saying, hey, I'm available. Like, I'm willing to answer questions. Because, as you said, it can be really scary asking for help. So when people are getting started in a project, you know, they're sort of seeing all of these people who are creating amazing things. You know, and I come along, I'm a total noob, and I haven't done anything, quote unquote anything. I haven't contributed anything to this project yet, and here are all these people who make this thing that I want to be a part of. Like, who am I to ask them a question, to take up their valuable time? And the majority of them don't think like that at all, but just making it public that you're willing to answer questions it helps to get over that. And then if you can get involved in some sort of formal mentoring, whether it's you know, something within your own project or as WordPress is involved with the Google Summer of Code, I think, you know, that's sort of the next level. That's a pretty hands-on sort of approach to mentoring, and that's an amazing experience for me. It was really, I'd never done anything like that, so I'd never had sort of someone who was basically like assigned to me to learn WordPress, and that was really daunting at the beginning because I was sort of, well, who am I to be teaching someone WordPress? You know, I just sort of figured it out. Like, I'm not a professional at it, and then you come to the realization that, hey, if you're doing it already, then yeah, you are a professional. If you know more than them, then you're mentor worthy. And it can be more than them about anything. It can be a tiny little fragment of a project. And if you know enough to pass information on, then you should be mentoring someone, because that's how the project lives on.
I certainly agree that formal mentoring projects are very important, and I have mentored some students in summer programs and things like that, and I feel proud of doing that. But I also think that the more informal mentoring that we're talking about here is really important. For example, this week on one of the mailing lists, that's part of one of the projects I work on, a newbie posted a question that no one answered for days that's in the frequently asked questions. And, you know, people were going to ignore him. And I decided, you know, if we ignore this person, he's probably going to go away and never come back. Whereas I just sent him simple message that said, look at the frequently asked questions. Here's the URL. And welcome to our community. We're glad that you're interested. I mean, that was like zero effort. And yet, hopefully the person thinks, gee, somebody cares, and they do want me to contribute, and so forth and so on. I think it's, as with anything else in life, it's the little simple 1-minute things you do that really accumulate and make a difference. Another thing that I've put a lot of thought into is very often you write anonymous critiques of proposals sent to conferences or something, and I go out of my way to make those kind and helpful because people are trying to do a good job and they don't know what's wrong with their what's it, and I think people really appreciate that. I've gotten nasty anonymous reviews, and that's really depressing and makes people want to quit. And then another thing I've done is I've tried to encourage people that I know, either personally or remotely, to do things like submit abstracts to conferences. You know, a friend of mine, I keep bugging her and saying, people are really interested in this hot topic we've done a little on, and she says, oh no, I'm not an expert in blah, blah, blah. And I said, you know, you could give a talk to this group. You easily have enough material for a 45 presentation. People want to learn about this, and you'll pack the room, you know, and it'll be great for your career. And you already know the material, just write it down. So I think this kind of one-on-one encouragement, tell people they're doing a good job, and do encourage them to stretch a little bit.
So how many, we're going to open to questions here in a second, but I wanted to do a real quick poll. How many of you are involved in open source in some form right now? Higher? Okay. How many are thinking about it?
So I'd put money on them all actually being involved. I bet you've all used the internet.
Yeah.
Ta-da! Good point. Okay, so let's open this up to questions, and we all promise we're going to be nice. Anybody? Come on up, don't be
I do
shy.
have a question. So I'm probably a newbie. I'm a newbie and not even a coder or anything, I'm an accountant. And I was wondering if it's all in English.
I'm going to take that question because with Google Summer of Code, we have student participants from 60 countries at a time. Traditionally, I would say the language of computer science is English, but I think this is also changing very rapidly. Knowing Portuguese or Chinese would be very helpful, but in the meantime, generally, English carries you through.
Anybody disagree?
I would agree with that, but add to it that especially things like documentation, they usually start in English, but they end up in every language. And most of a project like WordPress gets internationalized into, I think, about 170 languages now, something like that.
That's actually a really good place to start if you've got a community you're interested in getting into. Localization is hugely important. Google Summer of Code volunteers will translate the one-page flyer to go up in universities all over the world. Some of the languages, I'm not sure that many people do speak Klingon, but the other languages, yeah, actually it's probably pretty useful.
Completely unrelated to languages, there are a couple accounting software programs in the open source world, and we're sorely missing accountants to actually test them. I was involved in Ledger SMB for a little while because I have an accounting somewhat of an accounting background from some corporate work I did. So I was working on the Ledger SMB project, and since I had an accounting background, they thought I was the best person ever. I'm not really a coder, and I didn't do a lot, but I worked on a lot of workflow documentation and other things for them, and they thought it was really great because a lot of projects, especially smaller ones like that, they're very developer heavy, and the people working on them may not be experts in what they're doing. So awesome skills, very useful.
Go ahead.
So I have a question. Where's the money? Where's the profit? I'm an entrepreneur. I know there's a couple of women in the audience who are either entrepreneurs already or who are thinking about it within the next 5 years. And I mean, donating some time, donating some efforts, and contributing is all fine once in a while, but still, where's the money?
So I know it's been amazing within the WordPress community in the last probably 3 years. Mood lighting. In the last around 3 years, we've seen an explosion of an entirely new industry. So 3 years ago, there was nobody selling WordPress themes or plugins or even really WordPress services that much.
Stop that.
Now you're just messing with it. But literally, Automatic works with a lot of these commercial enterprises. So obviously, Automatic makes money through WordPress. But even ignoring that, people are making literally millions of dollars selling premium WordPress themes and custom sort of support packages for really advanced plugins and things like that. Everything that we help promote, and technically all plugins and themes are GPL, the style of licensing, so they can't actually restrict you from distributing or modifying what they're selling you. So technically what they're selling is support for what they're doing, or customizations that are not going to be distributed. So there's a huge industry around WordPress. Consultants, people developing customized solutions, things like that. Also training, people writing books. There's heaps of ways to make money with open source.
I think another way is what you don't have to pay for. I mentioned that I didn't go to college, so I was all self-taught, and I learned by looking at source code and getting involved in projects. So first of all, I didn't pay for an education, and now I make a pretty good living as a systems administrator on Linux. When I was learning all of that, I didn't need to pay a license for every time I fired up a Linux box. When I was learning about virtualization, I could have 15 Linux VMs running all at the same time and didn't have to pay 15 licenses. And it's been a huge boon to the company I work for. We do all our work is done on Linux. All the web servers and firewalls and everything we deploy is all Linux. And when we're developing the applications and working on the firewalls and stuff, we don't need all the licenses for all that development. We can toss up VMs and take them down and don't have to pay for any of that. So the money that we save by using open source has been tremendous, and has made, actually companies like Google be able to start and run millions of Linux boxes without having it, so.
I was just going to say, I think for people who are interested in entrepreneurship, open source is wonderful. And it is because it's so accessible, and also because the pace of change is so rapid. If you consider, again, my friend who became an Android trainer, there will be something new next year that no one knows what it is yet, and you can be the expert on this new thing. There's a real advantage, given the openness and the pace of open source development, to really keeping informed and looking for opportunities and pouncing on them. It's kind of not a secret, given the situation at my company, that I'm looking for a new job, and I've had something like, I actually don't know how many interviews I've had, but it's just an incredible booming area. Business and open source is really good. Linux is growing by leaps and bounds, and the whole ecosystem that it's part of is really just taking off. It's really amazing. Being gray-haired and creaky like Kat, and having come from the Unix background, I thought Unix was going to die about 1990. I thought that we were in the twilight years, and now it's killing, which is awesome. So, come on and join the party. The door is open. That's what I said.
And I want to dive in on that too, because I think this is off. So I'm an entrepreneur, right? I do training for people on all kinds of different platforms. I build WordPress tutorials. I help people understand how to work with a lot of different open source programs. So you don't have to just be a coder. It helps if you're a geek a little bit to be able to understand what you're trying to teach, but you can learn any of that from the communities. The community will support you, and you can go and be that go-between, kind of changes everything from Klingon to English, because sometimes that really is necessary. So being that person that can translate means that you can really help promote open source, be part of it, and create a business around that. So.
I had something to that actually. The author of the WordPress for Dummies book is Lisa Sabin-Wilson, a woman. And it's probably, I'm pretty sure it's the most popular best-selling WordPress book available. So she's sort of created another career for herself out of writing the original of that, and then every time we make a new release, she has to release another one. Very convenient.
Hi, I have a question. Say someone wants to get involved in open source, where would you find a group to join? How would you go about it?
Yeah, I'm trying not to use that G word, but there are a variety of websites. LWN.net is a Linux news site, but it's not just Linux. Slashdot, it has more of an entertainment focus, but you can learn more about that. Or, think about it from the other direction and think about something that interests you. And then go to the internet and start looking around, because there's a project for everything.
I think along the same lines, the first project I got involved with it was actually, I mentioned an IM gateway, so it was in my IRC client, I was able to connect to all my instant messenger things. And that was really great, because I only had to have one program looking for everything, and it worked out well. But I mean, it was, so I joined the project channel because I was, well, that's neat, they have a project channel. So it's software that I was using already. Also with the Ubuntu project, I had installed it on a laptop, and I said, well, these people seem nice, I'll go hang out in their channels for a while. And so it was really stuff that I was already using, and I was, so I was familiar with it in some regard, and then I just went for it. And so if you have anything that you're using now, maybe you're interested in how they made that.
Not too much to add, basically literally just search for it. I mean, anything that you're interested in, if you search for like that thing, free project or something like that, you'll probably find 50 projects. Just make sure you do your research and make sure that it's an active project, because there's a lot of dead ones out there. You don't want to go like investing a bunch of time in researching, reading up on their history, only to find that they actually stopped mailing last year or something.
Go backwards in time.
So not to be argumentative, but that's totally the opposite of any approach I've ever used. I've always been using open source software, and I mean, I'm not interested in doing any research at all, beyond the fact that I'm kind of obsessed with Engadget and so forth, and I want all those devices.